Hey everyone, today we're going to be diving into the Massachusetts iceberg. I haven't mentioned it on the channel before, but I've actually lived in Massachusetts my entire life, and I guess that means I'm somewhat qualified to explain this iceberg. As I tend to do, I will be skipping some entries either just because they're jokes or they aren't that interesting to talk about. I'll still link the iceberg I used in the description below if you want to check it out in full. With all that out of the way though, let's dive into the first layer. Also, just as an editor's note, in the background gameplay, I was doing like a Master Chief run of the Witch Queen campaign that I was going to make for a video, but I decided against it kind of after I did a few missions. So that's why in the background gameplay I'm just kind of walking around like an idiot. Also, the video is going to stutter every once in a while in the background. That's an issue with my capture card that I can't really fix right now. Anyway, enjoy the video. Bridgewater Triangle. This entry refers to the area in southern Massachusetts known as the Bridgewater Triangle, which is infamous for the many paranormal and supernatural happenings that have taken place there. According to this website, the name Bridgewater Triangle was first coined by Lauren Coleman, a cryptozoologist and author who wrote the 1983 book titled Mysterious America. According to Coleman, the points of the triangle are Rehoboth, Abington, and Freetown. In this part of the state, there have been reported ritualistic sacrifices, sightings of ghosts, cryptids, and UFOs. It's also home to the Taunton State Hospital, which is a psychiatric hospital where cruel medical practices, such as lobotomies and electric shock therapy, were used on patients. There's going to be a couple more entries surrounding the Bridgewater Triangle later, so I'll go in more depth once we reach those. Pukwudgies. Pukwudgies are a mythical creature that is said to live in North America, but is commonly associated with Massachusetts due to the high amount of sightings in the state. These creatures are said to be like little forest goblins that can shapeshift into animals and are said to use magic to torment people that annoy or disturb them. They have their origins in Native American mythology, but sightings of them persist to this day. Apparently, they most commonly appear as half-human, half-porcupine hybrids, and the police in Freetown, Mass., had to put up a sign in the Freetown Fall River State Forest that says Pukwudgie Crossing, which went up in 2017. Honestly, there's not much else to say. To me, this just seems like any old cryptid. I still think it's pretty interesting though, since they actually went out of their way to put up a sign due to the amount of people who were, complaining that there were Pukwudgies in the area. Busta Rhymes Island. There's an island in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, that was named by a group of friends after the rapper Busta Rhymes. The island doesn't have an official name, but after the guys who decided to name it Busta Rhymes Island geotagged it with that name on Google Maps, it gained a lot of attention from the internet, and the de facto name stuck. Cape Cod during the winter. There are two things that I think this entry is referring to. The first is the way Cape Cod is somewhat quiet and lonely during the winter months, as the amount of tourists and beachgoers is much lower when the beaches are closed and the water is too cold to swim in. I can see how this absence of people could be tied to ideas of liminal spaces and a potentially unsettling atmosphere. The second thing is the horrifically bad weather that the Cape gets in the winter. For those who don't live in the Northeast, you might be unfamiliar with a nor'easter, which is essentially the worst snowstorm you could imagine. The average winter in Massachusetts sees about 2 nor'easters, and Cape Cod gets the worst of it every single time due to it being right on the ocean. With that said, I'll leave it up to your interpretation of what this entry is really talking about. If I'm way off the money, then please tell me how much of a dumbass I am in the comments. I'll make like a super thread of all the things I get wrong and add corrections down there. Dighton Rock. Dighton Rock is a 40-ton stone that originally resided in the Taunton River in Berkeley, Massachusetts. The rock was notable due to the petroglyphs or carvings that were discovered on the rock by English colonizers in the 1600s. While the most logical theory surrounding these inscriptions is that they were done by Native Americans, more recent theories suggest that it was the Vikings, the Portuguese, or even aliens who left these. Another detail is, of course, that Dighton Rock was also discovered within the Bridgewater Triangle. Personally, I don't think that there's much else to this other than that it was left by the Native Americans of the region. MIT rates. I don't want to go too in-depth here, just so this video doesn't get age restricted, but I'll link an article that discusses this topic if you're interested. As a TLDR, MIT has a higher rate than the national average, with the rate being 10.2 out of every 100,000 students, which is obviously very distressing. I doubt there's anything conspiracy behind this, it's just very sad. The Big Dig. The Big Dig was a mega project in Boston that rerouted Interstate 93. It's called the Big Dig because it was a giant tunnel that was dug under the city and the inner Boston harbor. I think the reason it finds itself on this list is because it was a very troublesome process to get it constructed. There were constant delays, leaks, mismanagement, and even the death of one motorist. The death happened in 2006 when a large piece of the tunnel detached and crushed the passenger of a car. Construction lasted from 1991 to 2007, so it was far from a quick process. Boston Harbor cryptids. So I couldn't find anything on any Boston Harbor cryptids, seemingly because there are none. I don't want this entry to go to waste though, so I'll swap it with my own that is interestingly not on this list. The Brighton Tickler. This refers to a serial tickler who tormented multiple Boston college students in the spring of 2014. According to the police, this tickler would break into the homes of BC students and either watch them while they slept or tickle the bottoms of their feet as they laid in bed. There were apparently reports of this nature dating back 2 years prior to the time of this incident, and there were at least 10 incidents reported. Despite this apparent evidence, the police came out and said that the Brighton Tickler was actually just a hoax that was sensationalized by a Boston.com article. Regardless, there are still a lot of people who believe that the Brighton Tickler was real, and that he's still out there, waiting to strike again. Personally, this story just gives me the creeps. I hate the idea of someone breaking into my house, and the idea of someone breaking in and then tickling me in my sleep is just terrifying. 4 towns submerged to create Quabbin Reservoir. This entry refers to the creation of the Quabbin Reservoir, located in central Massachusetts. In 1927, the state passed the Swift River Act, which called for the 4 towns of Dana, Prescott, Enfield, and Greenwich to be flooded to provide more water for the residents of Boston. This story is pretty surreal because thousands of people were uprooted from their homes, their houses were burned, farmlands destroyed, and by 1946, the entirety of the 4 towns were submerged in the new reservoir. So now, in the center of the state, there's a giant underwater ghost town, and it kinda remains as a piece of dark history for Massachusetts. Deer Island Experiment. This entry refers to experiments that were conducted in the 1900s on Deer Island in Boston. These experiments were conducted on 62 prisoners who were promised pardons for their help in developing a flu vaccine. In the end, all the prisoners survived the trials and were immune to the flu, but a ward doctor contracted the virus and perished. The researchers published their findings, but there were no records of the prisoners involved ever receiving their pardon. I think this entry is just on the list because of its obscurity and somewhat morally ambiguous nature. I'm not sure if there were other experiments that took place on Deer Island that I'm missing, but like I said before, if that's the case, feel free to tell me a new one down below. Fall River Terror Goblins. Returning to the Bridgewater Triangle, we have Fall River Terror Goblins, which I unfortunately couldn't find any evidence for. I'm guessing this one is probably just an inside joke by the creators, so I'm just gonna move on. UMass Amherst Chimp Lab. This entry is pretty interesting. At the University of Massachusetts Amherst, better known as just UMass, there's apparently a secret monkey lab where researchers use macaws and marmosets for experiments. And I say secret because that's how it was treated for a decently long period of time, with spokespeople refusing to comment on it or outright denying knowledge of its existence. This was the status quo until around 2020, when PETA was sent about 40 hours of footage from inside the lab. These monkeys have been seen confined in extremely small cages with no social interaction, and they've even been recorded committing acts of self-harm by sticking their fingers into the corners of their eye sockets. A quote from an article I found while researching says, "One such test allegedly filmed in the video is the human intruder test, where an unfamiliar person enters the room, stands in front of the monkey's cage, and stares at the animal, sometimes for as long as 30 minutes. The experimenters filmed the monkey, then examined their responses to the intruder." There's still a lot of controversy surrounding this lab, with student groups organizing protests in February 2022 to call for the conditions of the animals to be improved, but it seems like little has been done so far. Honestly, I think these experiments are really fucked up, especially when they're not giving them, sunlight or the ability to move around, and all they're actually testing for is the behavior of the monkeys. Like, it's not like they're doing toxicology or something, trying to make new medicine. They're literally just trying to figure out how they act when provoked with stimulants. But yeah, pretty fucked up. Let's move on. Boston Ley Line Dead Zone. So this entry refers to a pagan concept called the ley lines, which are these lines of magic that run across the globe in a grid pattern. It's basically a mystical version of latitude and longitude. According to most ley line maps I could find, Boston has none running through it, and that's what this entry is probably talking about. At least one source I found said that ley lines are connected to paranormal activity, which I find kind of ironic then, because Boston is regarded as a decently haunted city, due to it being one of the oldest cities in the United States. And so if there's no ley lines, how come it's apparently so haunted? Discolored lobsters. I couldn't find much on this entry outside of a few articles talking about an extremely rare 1 in 30 million blue lobster showing up in a Westboro grocery store. I'm sure the creator of this list was probably just trying to spin the idea that there's more to this, but it doesn't seem like that's the case. Park Street construction cover for cult hideout. This entry also doesn't have much to it. Park Street Station is located on the Boston Common, and it has undergone construction like a dozen times. The creator didn't specify which bout of construction they were talking about, so while I think it's possible that a cult was living in the walls of Park Street while it was being constructed or renovated, the closest thing to evidence I could find was a Reddit post from a few years ago. This post discusses an encounter OP had with a strange woman on the Green Line. The woman was asking OP about their employment, where they lived and such, before making some odd comments about how they would benefit from her mentors, after which the woman got off at Park Street Station. Apparently, a similar story had been posted from another user, and that post specifically mentioned a strange organization called the Odyssey Study Group, which had used similar recruitment tactics on the T. But aside from that, I couldn't find any other evidence about a cult hiding out in Park Street, so let's move on. Quincy Quarry Incident. This entry refers to the Quincy Quarry, which was a popular cliff diving and swimming spot in Quincy, Mass. When it comes to the incident, there's a couple to choose from. And by a couple, I mean at least 51 reported deaths after its initial flooding. In the 1970s, the town dumped telephone poles and trees into the water to deter swimmers, but ultimately just added to the danger and mostly failed as deterrents. Many of the quarries were eventually drained to prevent people from drowning, but that hasn't stopped people from falling into the now debris-filled holes. Maddie in the Morning Lost Broadcast. Maddie in the Morning was a show that aired in the morning on the radio station KISS 108 and was somewhat popular among Mass residents. This entry refers to a supposed lost broadcast of the show. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any evidence of this broadcast existing or even being rumored to exist outside of this iceberg. It's entirely possible that there is a broadcast of this show that has been lost, never to be heard by Maddie in the Morning's audience. Central MA Black Sites. Black sites are theorized locations operated by the Central Intelligence Agency that remain largely unknown to the public, with the most famous one, and only officially confirmed one, being Guantanamo Bay, which was used to torture prisoners of the War on Terror. Now, this entry presents the idea that there are other black sites located in Central Mass, which, while I couldn't find any information on, could be entirely real. But I'm not going to speculate any further, I don't want to end up on a watch list. Hanover Mall Inside Job. The Hanover Mall was a mall located in, you guessed it, Hanover, Massachusetts. Over time, the mall declined in popularity until it was closed for demolition in 2020, before it was eventually rebuilt as Hanover Crossing, which is a terrible name. This entry states that the Hanover Mall, or more likely its eventual death, was an inside job. And I mean, maybe this is true, maybe there were some actors on the inside working against the mall's success, but I couldn't find any evidence suggesting that this might be the case. Fake towns. I think this entry refers to how it's pretty easy to make up a fake name for a Massachusetts town and have it be believable. Aside from that though, I don't think there's much to this entry. Secret T stops. This entry refers to the theory that there are secret MBTA stops along the various lines of the T. The closest thing I could find to this is actually an entirely abandoned tunnel that connects to a now defunct T-stop at Scollay Square, which was replaced by Government Center. There's also another abandoned tunnel near the Boylston T-stop, but other than those two, it's unclear if there are any more tunnels or stops hidden under Boston. Mark Wahlberg Artificial Intelligence. What this entry is talking about is an AI that can determine what you want to eat at a restaurant before you even order. Famous Bostonian and former hate criminal Mark Wahlberg is the co-founder of the popular Wahlburger restaurant chain, and he's an investor in the tech company Radiant, which developed the AI in question. Apparently, they do use this in restaurants, but I can't imagine how useful it really is. It just seems a bit out of touch. Every Boston movie actually happened. Honestly, I completely believe this entry is 100% true. Personally, I remember the time that Godzilla himself flattened the entire city of Boston in his epic climactic fight with King Ghidorah. Good times. Route 3, Exit 6 McDonald's is a gateway to hell. This entry refers to the McDonald's accessible via Exit 6 on Route 3, and claims that it is a gateway to hell. And just by looking at it, I can see why someone would draw that conclusion. First off, the colors are pretty faded, and you can tell that it's an older McDonald's because it has that weird single yellow band over the sign, which gives it a bit of a dated and uncanny vibe. Second, what the fuck is this? Did they put a roof on the sign? So, yeah, I think it's pretty fair to say that this is a portal straight to hell. Whitey Bulger still alive in the Berkshires. Whitey Bulger was an infamous Boston mobster who died in prison in 2018, but this entry suggests that his death was faked and he escaped to the Berkshires in Western Mass where he still lives today. I think it goes without saying that this is pretty unlikely, as he was 89 when it was reported that he had died. So despite what this entry says, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that Whitey Bulger probably did not escape to the Berkshires. Swampscott Gang Stalkers. Swampscott is a town in northern Mass, and this entry suggests that it's home to gang stalkers. While I couldn't find any concrete evidence of gang stalking in the town, a man who has a rap sheet of multiple violent crimes, including stalking, was arrested in 2020 for breaking into Governor Charlie Baker's home in Swampscott, where the governor's wife and daughter were staying. So while he may not be what you would consider a gang, he was definitely a stalker in Swampscott. Green Line A branch still in operation. The Green Line A branch was a branch on, you guessed it, the Green Line, that extended to Watertown from Boston. In 1969, this branch was completely abandoned and hasn't been in use since. So no, the A branch is not still in operation. Dunkin' Donuts Simulation. This entry is definitely a joke, but I'm still mentioning it because while I was researching, I did find something that is a little odd. It's a deleted Reddit post on the r/virtual reality subreddit titled A Dunkin' Donuts Simulation. The post is tagged photo/video, which means that the person who posted this apparently had some kind of Dunkin' Donuts simulation and had visual evidence of it. I'm actually really curious to see what this video was. I guess that this means that there is now an official piece of Massachusetts lost media out there. Hopefully one day it will surface and we can understand the true nature of the Dunkin' Donuts simulation. Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket are the same place. This entry refers to the two islands off the coast of Massachusetts, Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, and how they're the same place. And while they do have a lot of geographic and visual similarities, they are two separate islands and not the same place. I think this entry is just joking about how the two places are so similar that they might as well be the same place. But honestly, most of this iceberg is just a lot of shit posting, so yeah. 98.5 The Sports Hub equals Operation Mockingbird. 98.5 The Sports Hub is a very well-known sports broadcasting station licensed out of Boston. Operation Mockingbird is an alleged large-scale program by the CIA that began in the early years of the Cold War and attempted to manipulate American news media for propaganda purposes. So then, this entry claims that 98.5 The Sports Hub is actually a part of this Operation Mockingbird. While there's no clear evidence of this being the case, I can see why this station would be a good candidate for something like this. I mean, growing up, every time someone in this car would change the radio, at some point I would hear the Sports Hub. I still hear it to this day. If the CIA really was trying to send subliminal messaging through the radio, the Sports Hub would be a good station to choose. So even though there is no evidence for this entry, let's just say it's plausible. Black Swan Intelligence Asset. The Black Swan theory is a metaphor that describes an event that comes as a surprise, has a major effect, and is often inappropriately rationalized after the fact, with the benefit of hindsight. With this in mind, I have no idea what it has to do with fucking Massachusetts. Hey, maybe next time something horrible happens in the state, just look to the creator of this iceberg chart. I think they know something we don't. Chicopee, MA. Chicopee, Mass is just an enigma. If you ever visit that area, Massachusetts, please, for your own sake, just stay clear of Chicopee. North Quincy McDonald's is a Soviet base. We're talking again about McDonald's, and I think this one is even worse than the last. This is a McDonald's in North Quincy, Mass, and I think it's the strangest building I've ever seen a fast food restaurant in. And while there's no evidence that this building is being used by a foreign agent as a base of operations, if there was any McDonald's that was, it would 1000% be this one. 1970s Salem witch trials. I was actually pretty interested when I saw this entry, but unfortunately it doesn't seem like any witch trials happened in Salem, Mass during the 1970s. A series of trials did occur in Arizona during the 70s though, so I guess that's close enough. And that wraps up the Massachusetts iceberg. I know it kind of devolved into mostly jokes by the end, but hey, at least the first few layers were pretty good. It is very disappointing, though, that it kind of ended poorly, because I know there are definitely a lot of conspiracies surrounding the state that could have been on here. And although I did skip a lot of the lower entries, they mostly all consisted of jokes, and that wouldn't have really been interesting to talk about. No offense to the creator, of course, that's just how I felt. Anyways, thanks for watching this video. I've been Harvariety, and I'll see you next time.